Hello, everyone. Welcome to digestivereset.com. I have a treat for everyone. I have Kiran here with us. Kiran, you're a microbiologist, lecturer, and clinical researcher on human microbiome, the hottest topic, and functional medicine. You're currently working with probiotics. We know from the research that they work, and what interests us here is your passion for gut microbiome, your studies, and your love for your craft, and we have that in common. Please tell us more. Can you tell us about your recent developments?
Yeah, so actually, we just submitted 3 papers for publication and just got reports on 2 new studies that we completed. So a lot of exciting stuff. The 3 papers that we submitted for publication, one of them is on how can you modulate the microbiome using probiotics, right? Because at the end of the day, no matter what probiotic you take, it pales in comparison to the number of endogenous commensal bacteria you have in your gut. So you're taking a few billion CFUs in a product, and you're putting it into a sea of 100 trillion other bacteria. So unless your probiotic can cause a significant change in that population, it's not really going to have a significant lasting effect. And then the 2 most important changes based on the research on the microbiome for the last decade is increasing the diversity of the microbiome. So the more rich the microbiome is, meaning the more the number of different species that exist there, and then also the uniformity of the species. So the uniformity is important because you could have a really rich microbiome with lots of different species, but 7 or 8 of them are predominant over all the other ones. And those species are basically taking over, their metabolic functions are the predominant ones. All of these hundreds and hundreds of other species, they are really non-functional in that microbiome. So even though your richness, the uniformity is off, so you really don't have diversity. And we know that diversity in the microbiome is the healthiest measure of a microbiome. It dictates your risk for disease, it dictates how long you'll live, it dictates your body conditions, your hormone balances, your immune function. Everything is dictated by diversity of the microbiome. The second feature that is really important to a healthy microbiome is the presence and adequate numbers of keystone strains. So these are endogenous anaerobic bacteria that are really important for the maintenance of health. In fact, they are universal among everybody. Everybody has some level of these bacteria like Akkermansia muciniphila, Faecalibacterium prausnitzii, Bifidobacterium longum. These are really important bacteria that protect against disease. For example, Akkermansia in a healthy microbiome would make up 5 to 7% of the total microbiome. And it's inversely correlated, meaning a higher level of Akkermansia, there's significantly lowered risk for cardiometabolic syndrome and everything in it. So cardiovascular disease, diabetes, obesity, senile dementia, Alzheimer's, all of those things are inversely correlated with the amount of Akkermansia muciniphila in your system. The same thing with the other keystone strain I mentioned, Faecalibacterium prausnitzii. It's a really important species, again, can make up 5 to 7% of your total microbiome, and it's inversely correlated with all types of inflammatory conditions in the bowel, ulcerative colitis, Crohn's, colorectal cancer, and any inflammatory response, so leaky gut, for example. All of those things are inversely correlated. So when you have high levels of Faecalibacteria, you have very low risk for those conditions. People with those conditions have low or almost undetectable levels of Faecalibacteria, or very low levels where you can't detect them. They're still there, they're just at such low levels in the sea of 100 trillion that it's hard to pick it up with our existing technology. So those are the 2 very, very important characteristics of a healthy microbiome that's been affirmed and reaffirmed across dozens and dozens of studies over the last 10 years. And what we were trying to show is we can actually improve both characteristics of the microbiome with the right type of probiotic. And we use the Endospore-based probiotic. So as it turns out, you put in the Endospore probiotic in 3 weeks, in as little as 3 weeks, we got almost a 40% increase in the diversity of the microbiome. right? So imagine you've got this microbiome that is not uniform, that doesn't have a lot of functioning species. You put these 5 strains into the system, and then all of a sudden in 3 weeks, you've got 200-300 other bacteria that are now proliferating at a very uniform rate to most of the other bacteria. So you've got this diversity back within the microbiome. Nothing has been shown in clinical research to be able to bring diversity back utilizing a probiotic or some sort of nutrient. And then the second part is we saw a significant increase in those keystone strains. So we saw about a 10 to 100-fold increase in Akkermansia, in Fecalum bacteria, and Bifidum longum, in a bunch of different lactobacilli. So what we're seeing is these spores have the ability to go in and find the good bacteria, enhance their growth, and suppress the growth of the bad or overgrown bacteria. So that type of modulation of the microbiome is so significant, and nobody's ever demonstrated that before in a clinical trial with any kind of product. So that was really exciting. We had 2 studies related to that. We also submitted a study for publication on elevated triglycerides. So these were in 90 subjects, 90 days, in subjects that had over 200 triglycerides. And what we saw was about a 35% reduction in triglycerides, which is better than any drug or any product on the market. You know, Lovaza, that prescription fish oil, brings it down by about 25%. Statins barely move triglycerides. Really, it's just lifestyle changes that people are supposed to intake. But that tends to be really hard for most people. And so the ability to be able to bring down the triglyceride levels, of course, are beneficial in themselves, but how it brings down the triglyceride levels is showing, it's demonstrating that there's a huge global health benefit as well. So that's another paper that we submitted. I'm not aware of any other probiotic on the market that has been shown clinically to reduce triglycerides, which of course, you know, as you know, triglycerides are a major marker for disease risk, right? And in fact, it's a better marker for disease risk than HDL and LDL cholesterol. So,
wow, amazing. And was it something that you accidentally found, just like anything wonderful in medicine we found, like penicillin by accident or other things? Or were you specifically researching that benefit?
No, totally accidentally found it. So when we did our leaky gut study that we published last year, and these were people that did not have elevated triglycerides, but we saw in the treatment group a significant drop, even with people on average around 140, which is not elevated by any means. We saw a lowering of triglycerides, and it was statistically significant, meaning the data was real. And so we said, wow, we did not expect that. And if it can lower it in people that didn't even have elevated triglycerides, then maybe it will be even a significant drop in people with elevated triglycerides. So that's why we did the study. A lot of the stuff, you know, what's great about it is we get to work with doctors and practitioners like yourself, and a lot of the ideas that we get for clinical trials will come from what the practitioners tell us they're seeing in the clinical setting. You know, I mean, a lot of these are N of 1, but they are being observed by a really astute clinician, and you know the patient's history, you know all the variables, and so we'll get docs telling us, hey, I'm seeing this, you know, which is really interesting. I didn't expect to see it, and we'll go, okay, we got to figure out the mechanism. How would it do that? And then we do a trial to verify it. So it's really been interesting because we're continuously doing a discovery process, and we have 13 clinical trials going on right now.
That's fantastic. I get very excited about gut microbiome. It's one of my favorite topics.
It is, yes, and more we come to find out how omnipotent it is. You know, it's all powerful when it comes to our body. You know, we just completed. Oh, this is another trial completed. I forgot to mention to you, which will also be submitted for publication probably in April. It's a dermatology study. So we looked at, you know, healthy normal cohorts, but a portion of the cohort had acne on the skin. And what we're looking at is, can we create any changes in the skin by taking an oral probiotic, one that we know stops leaky gut, improves all of these good bacteria, diversity and all that. And then in 30 days, here's what we saw. We saw a significant increase in skin hydration. a significant reduction in wrinkle appearance, a significant reduction in sebum excretion. We saw changes in the skin lipid profile, changes in the skin inflammatory markers, and then reduction in blemish appearance and number of blemishes in the acne subgroup. You know, so, and that's just 30 days without doing anything else. We're still waiting on our data on the microbiome on the skin. We want to see, and that would be really interesting to see, is if you change the gut microbiome, does it somehow change the bacteria on the skin? We suspect it would.
That's unbelievable.
Yeah.
That's fantastic. I wanted to ask you, because I do have clients that are very well educated, and they are also researching on their own. I am all for empowered patients, and I appreciate when my clients learn on their own. So I do get questions about things like, how close are we to make probiotics that we know are if we're low on these certain species, how close are we get to probiotics that take care of it? You kind of mentioned that right now, but you know how people think, if we're low on F-Zic, why can't we just get F-Zic in and just work it this way? So explain a little bit about how certain species are tremendously low, and that it is a risk for diseases or even colon cancer, and how the Spore probiotics can affect the ones that are that's really low in the amount of in the microbiome.
Yeah, so that's a really important concept for people to understand. So I'm glad you brought it up. We have to remember that our gut is an ecology. And like any ecology where you have multiple species, you, based on the pressures on the ecology, you know, the things that are coming in and affecting that whole ecosystem, you will have selection for certain organisms within that ecology. So even though you have these keystone strains in your gut, these keystone strains are very sensitive to things like pesticides, herbicides, antibiotics. They also require really complex carbohydrates and resistant starches that for fuel. They don't metabolize the simple carbs very well. They don't metabolize the generic kind of fibers, and both soluble and insoluble. They need those very special types of complex carbohydrate-based nutrients. And so all of these things we are doing to the ecology of the gut, exposing it to all of these antimicrobials and antibiotics, and our diets, our processed food diets, and the low quality of the food that we eat, basically creates a selection pressure to bring these organisms' growth levels down and increase the growth level of yeast and pathogenic or unfavorable bacteria. So now we have this significant imbalance within the microbiome, and that imbalance is perpetuated by all of our lifestyle choices. Now, all of a sudden, we, you know, and this dawned upon us that there are likely microbes out there that are designed to protect the host, right? And the reason we thought about that is because one of the things to understand about humans is we are really incapable of almost anything. You know, we have so few genes. We have 22,000 functional genes in our chromosomes, and that sounds like a lot if you don't understand genomics. But you know, if you look at a rice plant, it has 38,000 genes, or an earthworm has almost 40,000 genes. An earthworm in a rice plant has way more capability than we do.
Wow.
Right? We can barely code enough to form our own hair and eyes and nose and all these physical features, let alone doing things like controlling 100 trillion bacteria. So then the question dawned upon us, you know, if we can ourselves control the microbiome population, because we know for health, this microbiome population is really important. So there has to be a mechanism in place to keep things under control, right? Or humans would maybe not have made it through the course of evolution. Because we don't have a mechanism in there to go, you go down, you go back up, and so on. And so it dawned upon us that the big difference between us these days and our ancestors was their intimacy with the environment, right? And so we looked to see, are there organisms within the environment that our ancestors would have come in contact with frequently that can play that role in regulating the microbiome? So maybe we outsource this function to other bacteria that are outside of the environment. And as it turns out, we totally did. You know, the bacillus endospores that we work with were first discovered for their function in World War II. When the German army was in North Africa with their campaign, a lot of the soldiers were dying not because of the war, but of dysentery and gut infections, right? And when they what they noticed was that when the locals would get sick to the stomach, what they would do is actually go find dried camel dung, and they would eat the dried camel dung. And the dried camel dung would somehow cure that infection, that dysentery. And so they took a bunch of the dried camel dung back to Germany, and looking through it, what they found that had that antimicrobial type of property was a Bacillus subtilis endospore, right? So they launched a dysentery prescription drug using this probiotic in 1952. And that product is still on the market today, sold in 2/3 of the world. It's a Bacillus spore. When we saw that, we go, wow, okay, so Bacillus spores have been designed by nature to be able to go in, find pathogens and things that shouldn't be there at that level and bring their growth down. And then maybe, at that time we didn't have the data, maybe they could increase the good bacteria, or maybe the good bacteria will increase automatically because they are bringing down the pathogens. And then when you look deeper into it, you see that they've been using these endospores in the feed industry, in chickens and pigs and cows, so that they don't have to use as much antibiotics, because they can treat these animals with probiotics to reduce pathogen load versus antibiotics. So we said, these are the perfect candidates for us to have outsourced this function to, because we don't have to do it ourselves, and we just have to be smart enough to eat dirt like our ancestors did, right? But now we've lost that intelligence, so we stop eating dirt. We put these big concrete sterile barriers between us and these really important bacteria, and so we don't get them anymore. So they're not there to regulate our gut. And as it turns out, when you put these guys in, they come in, they use a fancy mechanism called quorum sensing, which is bacteria reading other bacteria's signature. They find the pathogenic bacteria or the overgrown bacteria. They'll go sit next to them in the intestinal lining. They can produce up to 25 different antibiotics in that little microenvironment to bring down the growth of those bacteria. And as they do that, they actually produce prebiotics and other compounds that feed some of the good bacteria. So that's how they're going in and kind of orchestrating the microbiome. What's so amazing about it to me is we have no idea what it should look like for our microbiome to be healthy, outside of the fact that we know we want it diverse and we want some of these keystone strains. You know, they're the ones that have the intelligence to go in, look around, understand what is off, and fix it specifically, right? It's such a beautiful coevolution story, and it's such a shame that we no longer have this relationship with those microbes. And so all we are doing is we're just smart enough to understand and appreciate what nature has done for us, and then harnessing that and bringing it back into our system. You know, we can never create or invent a bacteria that does this. You know, this took millions of years of coevolution, of living on the land, of eating dirt, of these bacteria going in, you know, finding their way through the gut, going out through defecation, being reintroduced again. All of that cycle, those millions and millions of cycles of doing that, has created this amazing police for our gut, and we just have to be smart enough to use it.
It's so beautiful. And it only took, what, 70 years, close to 70 years to get back into the idea. And, you know, pharmacology, that would be like a total mind-boggling thing. Like, you really don't know because you didn't make the chemical, and you don't really know the mechanism of action. You understand, right? You don't understand how it's working.
Yeah, it's really fascinating. You know, but what we figure out is, so we do a clinical trial first. We say, okay, if these strains can increase diversity, if they can increase these keystone strains and increase short chain fatty acid production, if they can conduct those mechanisms, then we should be able to see in clinical trials that impact on the skin, that impact on the gums. We're doing a gingivitis study. We should be able to see that impact on triglycerides, on leaky gut. And so what we do is we go into the clinical trial first, and then we see if we actually get that impact on human subjects. And then when we do, we go back and do more in vitro studies to figure out the mechanism. But then figuring out the mechanism from a bacteria standpoint, what exactly they are doing is going to be possible. I don't know if we ever will. You know, I don't know if we have the capability.
I think you might. I think you might. I have this completely optimistic view. There's going to be one day when we're on the same level.
Yeah.
So what would you say be like quick tips to keep our gut microbiome in good balance?
Yeah, so one of the most important things is to reduce the negative stressors on our microbiome. Of course, one of the most prevalent ones out there is Roundup and herbicides and pesticides that are basically on all our foods. So there are lots of websites and resources now that list the foods that tend to have the highest amount of Roundup. For example, kids, their highest amount of Roundup is found on Cheerios. You know, because it's an oat-based food. It's actually like 10,000 times higher than a bunch of other cereals below it, right? And it's insane the impact that that can have on the gut, because that's another study we just completed, which we could talk about if we have time. And so, you know, being smart about choosing your food sources, go organic as much as you can. Even though on organic products you do find some glyphosate residue, it's still better to push the market towards organic so that people start using this stuff less and less, so it doesn't contaminate our soil and drinking water as much. And then eating a diverse diet is really important. The diversity of the diet will dictate the diversity of your microbiome to some degree. Eat lots of different things, just small amounts of lots of different things, roots and tubers, you know, and vegetables and fruits and a variety of meats. And then, of course, get these spores in your system. You know, the spores are so important. Like I said, we've outsourced that fixing activity to these bacteria, and if you don't have them in your system, then inevitably your gut is going to go dysfunctional. That's just unavoidable. You know, as much as we try to practice clean eating, clean lifestyle and all that, we live in a very modern toxic world, and everything around us is toxic, and all of those things are toxic to our gut. And so we need that daily protection in there. A couple other tips that I can think of is intermittent fasting. Intermittent fasting, which is a 16-hour fast, 8-hour feeding window, can actually improve the diversity of your gut, can clean up things that are being putrefied in the intestines. And then, of course, it also upregulates autophagia, which cleans all your messed up cells and your messed up mitochondria and all that stuff. It's really important. And then, one last thing is attitude, right? So stress. Stress is one of the biggest inducers of leaky gut, inflammation, and stress can actually increase the virulence of pathogens that are sitting idly by in the gut, both viral and bacterial pathogens. So your own release of norepinephrine and all of these stress hormones actually increases the virulence of pathogens like Streptococcus and Staphylococcus. So we can influence the microbiome to some degree, but typically in a negative way if we are being not mindful and we have a lot of stress in life. So stress has such a huge impact on the permeability in the intestines. It can have an impact on what's growing in your gut. And so, practicing some degree of mind-body ness and having, a life that's lower down in the stress response can have a significant impact on your gut and then in your health in general.
That's perfect. I think, you can't get a better advice than that. It's one of the newer concepts when we know for a fact that major stress can change your gut microbiome within hours, within days. It's something that you have to support. So
and great evidence of that, and everybody can relate to this, is when you get really nervous, you feel it in your gut. And a lot of times people get loose bowels, right? And why is that? Well, it's a change in the microbiome, change in the release of toxins, cramping in your intestines, and then certain types of toxins cause the diuretic effect, and so you end up with the loose bowels because of that. So everybody can relate to that. What they don't understand is, even though that's happening acutely, what's happening chronically is you're increasing the leakiness in your gut, increasing the inflammation, and in fact putting yourself at higher risk for most chronic illnesses.
For sure. That's very important to know. So tell us about probiotics. I want to ask you about the importance of probiotics, that some prebiotics that have importance over probiotics. How do they weigh against each other? Where do we need to focus? Because a lot of people don't even understand the concept of prebiotics yet.
Yeah, so that's a really important question, especially nowadays, because prebiotics are becoming hot, and like anything else that's trending and becoming hot, you're going to find, you know, overnight 150 companies with the best product in the world on the marketplace, and you have to be cautious about it. So when we started studying prebiotics about 3.5 years ago, what I found was that the vast majority of prebiotics that are available in the market are non-specific, meaning they are food for bacteria, which is the idea behind prebiotic, is that you consume this food, humans can't digest this food, so it goes down into your bacteria, and your bacteria get to digest it and then proliferate and do well. The problem is the majority of prebiotics can feed bad bacteria just as well as it feeds good bacteria. You know, and that's an issue, because if you already have this imbalance, like we talked about, most people do, and then you send in the bacteria food in there, you keep feeding the bacteria that's already higher, and that can cause even more problems and more damage. So with regards to prebiotics, you have to consider using a prebiotic as a synbiotic. So, you know, I hate to have to throw another term at people, because now they have to keep remembering things. But what we need out of a prebiotic is we need a prebiotic that has been shown clinically to specifically enhance beneficial functions in the gut. So whether it feeds specific organisms that are really important to the gut, like Akkermansia and Fecalum bacteria, or whether it increases short-chain fatty acids, which is really important to the gut. So it has to have clinical evidence of those specific core functions. Now, the best case scenario is you're taking that synbiotic, like I said. So you're taking a probiotic that has very specific function in the gut. You know, it does all of these beneficial healing things like increasing diversity, increasing short-chain fatty acid, increasing keystone strains. But then you add in a prebiotic that works in synergy with that probiotic and basically enhances all of the effects of the probiotic. That's the best case scenario. It's called a synbiotic. You have a probiotic and a prebiotic that have been clinically validated to be supportive of one another, and their effects are can multiply rather than negate the effects with one another. So if you buy a probiotic from random company A and a prebiotic from random company B, that probiotic may be creating certain functions in the gut. The prebiotic might be creating antagonistic functions in the gut. You don't know if it makes sense to take them both together. So what we've done is we've worked on developing a true synbiotic, and that's one of the papers that we submitted for publication. We showed that when you take the spores into the system, it enhances the growth of certain bacteria, increases diversity, does all of these beneficial things. And then when you put in the prebiotic, which are oligosaccharide-based prebiotic, the ones that we've chosen, it specifically enhances all of those functions almost 50 to 100%. So it's a true synbiotic. Now, and I hate to say this to your listeners, but the vast majority of probiotics you have access to in the market aren't going to do anything in your system. They're generic. They're just throwing a bunch of strains from random places. There's no clinical substantiation. There's no science behind it. It's the whole mentality, what I call the kitchen sink formula, where more is better. Let's just throw everything in there and have 300 billion or 400 billion for no apparent reason at all. And you know, just to look fancy when it comes to marketing. So be very careful with the probiotics you choose, but you want a probiotic first, and find a probiotic first that works well for you. And then when the probiotic is doing its job, making the changes in your gut, you want to bring in the right prebiotic to reinforce those positive changes and feed those good new bacteria that are doing well in your system. We took all of the guesswork out of that and created the Megaspore and then the Mega Pre, which supports it, and we've submitted a clinical trial to prove that it works synergistically together.
That's great. That's great, because I get a lot of inquiries or comments from my readers that try a lot of different prebiotics available on the market, and they get severe gasiness or some bloated symptoms, and they feel worse than they felt for months after starting the probiotic. So now that you're combining your product, your prebiotic that you selected to the Spore probiotic, do you know in your clinical trials, do people experience the same thing, like the gassiness and the pain and bloating, or since it's in a symbiotic relationship, you're not supposed to have the symptoms?
Yeah, so it's tremendously minimized. It's hard to say that 100% of people wouldn't have that experience. We find that the number of people that do have some sort of discomfort, if you do the full dose right off the bat, is probably less than 4 or 5%. The vast majority of people do really well on it, and it significantly enhances all of the benefits that they're already getting from the probiotic. But having the probiotic there is really important, because remember that probiotic competes with all of these dysfunctional or unfavorable bacteria. So if those unfavorable bacteria are attempting to try to metabolize the prebiotic for benefit, the probiotic's there to shut it down. And so, but we do recommend people to go a little bit slow. The full dose is 1 whole scoop, especially people with SIBO or conditions where they've been sensitive to prebiotics and carbohydrates in the past. We tell them to start slow, do a 1/4 scoop, do a 1/2 scoop, try that for a few days and then bump yourself up. You don't have to start at a full scoop right off the bat. But again, having the probiotic in there makes it, minimizes any sort of negative response.
Yeah, that's a very, very good point. And correct me if I'm wrong when I say that you have to start with a small amount of prebiotic, and then as you tolerate, you increase to the full dose. That is the way I explain it, and you definitely can correct me here. The way I explain it is the more you introduce the prebiotic, the more food it would give to the bacteria that you desire, but it needs adjusting, because now when you overgrow too fast, you could have the symptoms. But the more now you will have, the more you could introduce. Am I explaining it correctly to my viewers?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's a term that's used in some of the research papers on this topic. It's called carbohydrate utilization.
Mm-hmm.
So when you add in larger doses, especially if you start off with larger doses, you actually get reduced utilization of the carbohydrates by a good variety of bacteria. And in fact, a lot of it may even go completely undigested and go out in your stool, because there's only so much that the microbiome, even though it's so vast with 100 trillion organisms, these are teeny tiny bacteria. So they don't need a whole lot of anything, right? And so, putting in too much at once, even they can't metabolize it all, and it'll just pass through because your gastric system is constantly moving. So you're better off starting small and taking it in small doses at a time throughout the day. So for example, the way I drink the prebiotic, it's a powder, so I mix it in like a bottle like this, sometime in the afternoon when I've broken my fast. And then for the rest of the day, I'm just sipping on this, and this is my drink for the rest of the day. So I'm taking in small doses at a time of the prebiotic and never overwhelming the system at once.
Perfect. That's perfect. Thank you. So tell me, between IBD, IBS, and chronic hormone imbalance, do you know there's a preference at this point of research? Because, it's all relatively new. There's not much available. I did my doctorate paper not that long ago. It was just about 1.5 years ago. And there was so little information on probiotics. Now, between that time that I finished, there's much more, and your studies are great. What would you say recommendations are right now between IBD preference, IBS, and chronic hormone imbalance?
Yeah, so it's interesting. So IBS often precedes IBD, right? So a lot of times people that are IBD subjects, whether it's ulcerative colitis or Crohn's, for years they present as IBS before there's enough damage to the gut lining or the colon to scope them and see that, oh, they have ulcerative colitis or they have Crohn's disease. The pathology is there when you scope them, but the cause and the symptoms could have been there for a long time before that, and more often than not, they present as IBS. So what's happening now with a lot of gastroenterologists is when people come in with chronic IBS and it's really bad, but they don't have the bloody stools yet, they'll start testing them for calprotectin, they'll start doing sedimentation rates and other things to see if there is some sort of autoimmune component to it, or is their bowel just irritated, and maybe contracting too much and so on. So everything in the IBD and IBS space is protected against by Fecalum bacteria prosnitzi. That's where all of the studies are. It's this one strain that seems to be universally protective against inflammatory bowel conditions or irritable bowel syndrome. And in inflammatory bowel conditions, we can throw in colorectal cancer in there as well. And so the goal has been, and you'll see that in the review papers, on the meta-analysis papers on this topic, the goal is increasing Fecalum bacteria prosnitzi is going to be paramount to treating IBD or IBS, Crohn's or colitis. And the other thing is there was a review paper that analyzed a number of other papers, and then they did their own subjects, and they found that in IBD subjects, when you age match them to the same kind of cohort with the same age without IBD, they found one really significant difference, and that was lower diversity in the IBD group, and then lower levels, of course, of Fecalum bacteria prosnitzi. So diversity, again, plays a role in this, and the same thing occurs with the other condition. You mentioned IBD, IBS,
and chronic hormone problems.
And hormone problems, yeah. So, and when you look at hormone imbalances, the big issue there is diversity. So as it turns out, the microbiome, all of these gut bacteria that we have, can produce almost all of the hormones that our endocrine system produce. They produce estrogen and testosterone, and of course, serotonin and dopamine, and all of these stress hormones as well. All of the hormones can be produced by the microbiome. And then a lot of the hormones are also metabolized by the microbiome to get rid of them once it's produced. Estrogen is a great example of that. People with estrogen dominance issues tend to have low or poor metabolism of estrogen through a constellation of bacteria called estrobolome. Estrobolome is a group of microbes within the gut whose job it is to take estrogen that's being produced and not utilized and break it down and metabolize it. And guess what they do with it, which is really fascinating. The breakdown products of estrogen in the gut are transported through the mucosal system to the vaginal canal, and those breakdown products feed the most important vaginal bacteria to maintain vaginal health, right?
Yeah.
So it's fascinating. Yeah, and that's why in perimenopausal, postmenopausal women, you start to get vaginal dryness, bacterial vaginosis, and all these issues that are characteristic of a dysfunctional flora in the vaginal canal, and that's because of the lower estrogen production, lower metabolism estrogen, and less food for those good bacteria, right? And again, all of that is dictated by diversity in the microbiome, and so there isn't a single probiotic out there outside of the one that we are working with and doing the research with that has been shown to increase Fecalum bacteria prosnitzi and increase diversity. So all of those conditions, even though they're so different, hormone imbalance, ulcerative colitis, IBS, they seem clinically very different. They all have the same dysfunction.
Root cause, right.
Exactly, yeah. Same root cause.
I get it. And I mentioned that estrobolome in my book, and the second book that I'm finishing up. So I think it's so amazing. This like all new information. So I'm gonna combine two questions in one kind of. Okay. I get asked what is the best probiotic on daily basis from different places, and I'm sure you're getting that often. And also people do like to ask the best time to take the probiotic. Is it during the day, during the night, in between meals, away from the meals? So from your clinical research, because I say and I recommend from the best of my clinical knowledge and the information available right now, there's still not much research in the pharmaceutical studies.
Yeah.
So your studies, do you know what you're basing the information from? Tell me more.
Yeah, as far as what time of day to take it.
Yeah, and what when you say the best probiotic, I know you see so much benefit out of the spores. Are they going to be different kind of spore blends? What do you where you are in that kind of in that place?
Sure, yeah, and to me, far and away, the best type of probiotic is a spore-based probiotic because of what they can do to fix the imbalances in our gut. You'll have other probiotics that have single strains that have single functions. For example, Bifidobacterium infantis 35624 that's found in product A can reduce the duration of diarrhea in kids, but that's basically what it does. So if you have incidence of diarrhea, you use that probiotic with that strain to try to reduce it. And then, Rhamnosus GG has been well studied for certain viral infections and so on, so it can help with those singular things. As far as overall global benefit to the gut, especially as we're trying to fight against all of the toxicity that we are inevitably exposed to, the spores do jobs that no other probiotics have ever been shown to be able to do. So they're extremely important. And then as far as the best spore formula, then it's the Megaspore. It's the only one that has the 5-strain combination, and that's the one that we do all of our studies with as well. So at the end of the day, the easiest answer to what is the best probiotic, I would say it's a probiotic that is the most well-researched, has a lot of use by health professionals, because health professionals are far more astute as to the impact of the probiotic, and if they continue to use it, obviously they're seeing some sort of clinical benefit. And then a company and a product or a company that is investing in the science, right? Because in my view, companies in our space that are producing products and all that should be dedicating a good portion of their revenue to research, because it's our job to elevate the knowledge base. And the vast majority of companies don't do that at all. They do no research at all. And so that's a significant issue in our industry. So I would say the companies that are focusing on research, probiotic that has been part of one or more studies at least, and then one that helps modulate your gut and protect you against the toxicity in the world around you. That's really one of the most important probiotics. And then to me, that's the Megaspore. And then what time of day to take it. So we're not seeing any difference really in the time of day, as long as you're taking it with food. And in fact, when we do the clinical trials, we don't specify to people what time of day to take it, because we kind of want a random sampling of what people would naturally do. And so I don't think that there's a time of day issue as long as you're taking it with food.
I also always been recommending most of the probiotics with food, although a lot of practitioners out there still stick to empty stomach. I would say to my I would stick with my recommendations. And would you?
Right. Yeah, because if you think about it, so where did our ancestors get their probiotics? They got it when they ate stuff, right? Because they ate food and they picked roots and tubers and all that had bacteria on it, and that was their probiotic. So it went together with food. Also, a good probiotic will help you digest your food, because they should be producing digestive enzymes. Now, I've questioned a lot of doctors and practitioners as to why they continue to recommend this in-between meals thing, and that was perpetuated by probiotic companies a couple of decades ago. The reason for that is most of these companies have probiotic products that don't survive through the stomach acid, right? And stomach acid is going to be heightened when you start eating food. One of the first signals when you start chewing is the release of hydrochloric acid in the stomach as it's waiting for food to come in. So the whole idea is trying to skirt around that hydrochloric acid and do it in between meals. That's where it all came from, because they're making products with these weak bacteria that cannot survive naturally through the gastric system, and they're trying to find tricks to skirt it around the gastric system, or skirt it past the gastric system when it's not as intense. But as it turns out, even at empty stomach pHs, without surges of hydrochloric acid, those bacteria all die in the stomach anyway.
Yeah. I'm totally with that. I also think of, I give examples to people when they eat their food or fermented food or sauerkraut or other fermented, naturally cultured probiotic foods. They eat it, right, with food. So that, and that's the best. I mean, really, from food, you get an excellent way of getting the probiotics in. It's one of
Yeah,
like nature's way of getting those in.
absolutely. And can you see our ancestors, our hunter-gatherer ancestors, finding a time to go find bacteria in between meals and consuming it, and putting it in a refrigerator and all that stuff. So any of that stuff that is required means that that bacteria is not designed to be consumed as a probiotic.
For sure. So anything that you would know at this point about interactions between antibiotics and probiotics, how we are in our industry recommend them to be spaced apart.
Yeah.
Did you learn anything new in the past couple of years from your studies? Do you also wait between megaspores and antibiotics when people have to take antibiotics?
Yeah, so the average antibiotic should clear your small bowel and your gut in 3.5, 4 hours. So typically people say space it between your conventional probiotics, you space it 3, 4 hours apart from the antibiotic. But at the end of the day, it really doesn't matter because the likelihood of that probiotic making it through the gastric system is way low. So the antibiotic is not really of a concern because it's going to die in the stomach anyway. So now when it comes to the spores, it's a different story. We actually completed a study a year and a half ago where we dosed the probiotic, the spores, with Xifaxan at the same time for hepatic encephalopathy patients. And very well, Xifaxan is the strongest gut antibiotic there is. It was developed originally for traveler's diarrhea, and now it's used for SIBO and other things because it stays in the gut and it kills bacteria. And the fact that you can dose the probiotic with Xifaxan and it still has an effect shows you how stable they can be even in that realm. So when it comes to the spores, we tell people if you can separate it from the antibiotic, that's fine. If it's not convenient because you're taking the antibiotic twice a day or 3 times a day, and you want to take the probiotic with it, that's totally fine as well. In our study with the Xifaxan, the people took it with the antibiotic.
Awesome. Now, a super important question, especially, because there's now since there are different probiotics on the market and spores do look amazing comparing to others, you will always now get haters, right? That will find something to say. So your competitors would probably say something like the length of the treatment of megaspores should be less because it's not effective. And is there potential of overgrowing bacteria with megaspores because they're that effective? What would you recommend as a length of treatment with probiotics?
Yeah, so and we've done these types of studies, fortunately, to really have good answers. What we see is that even when you dose really high levels of the spore, let's say 10 times the megaspore dose, you don't get an overgrowth of spores in the gut. Spores have their own natural threshold that they don't tend to exceed, and that's around 10 to the 6 CFUs per gram of stool. And that's relatively low compared to a lot of the other bacteria, like a healthy gut with healthy Akkermansia would have 10 to the 9. So your audience might not understand what that means. 10 to the 6 is about 1 million cells per gram of stool. 10 to the 9 is 1 billion cells per gram of stool. So it's a huge difference between the two. Yeah, and so spores are quite effective at small doses, and then they're also transient. So they spend about 21 days in your gut, they fix your gut, and then they ball back up into the spore form and they go back out in defecation because their whole job is to get out and spread around and get to other hosts and keep doing this over and over again. And so the way we design the therapies and how long you go is you follow symptomology. There are people with IBS that after just a month they've made such a significant difference in their bowel movements and their health of their gut. They can stop the treatment, or better yet, they can go on a maintenance dose, because you need some natural exposure to these bacteria all the time. But then some people with severe inflammatory conditions, like we work with a patient through my business partner's clinic who had, almost full body eczema. And that took 9-10 months to significantly reduce it, because that's such a complicated and complex issue, right? So there is no definite time for therapy. It's really about the condition, the patient, their lifestyle, all of the things that they're doing. Conventional probiotics really don't have any approach with that stuff. For us, we say, start to fix the gut with the spores. And as you fix the gut, if you're doing other therapies, those therapies will become more effective. If you're not doing other therapies and you're just looking at the spores, then just follow your symptoms. And as things get better, when your condition's under control, you can go to maintenance. People can take it 2 or 3 times a week rather than daily, and still maintain the same benefits.
Yeah, thank you for that information, because you mentioned that you mentioned the IBS patient that would feel better maybe in a month, because and then they have to go on just an example to go on a maintenance therapy, because we're naturally dependent on some kind of bacteria, because we really don't have any access to bacteria now. Everything's antibacterial, right? The air, the chlorine in the air. We don't play in the dirt. So naturally, you need, we're made to have some kind of bacterial activity going on, which we totally depleted of everywhere.
Right.
And what do you tell me what your opinion on probiotic sprays, probiotic cleaning products? I've seen a few companies that make these products and make claims. What do you think?
So I love the concept, and that's something that I've always thought about as well, because there are studies that show in certain regions of the world, in the households where the doors and windows are open more often, more bacteria are coming in. People in the house tend to be much healthier than in houses that are closed off and sterilized and so on. The problem with the supplement industry is there's a lot of really good marketers out there and very, very few scientists involved, right? And so as soon as concepts take hold, there are smart people with lots of creativity that can create products that look good and sound good, and really follow good concepts. But the science is not there, meaning they don't really do trials. They don't do tests. We don't see science coming out of them. So I've seen the products on the market. I love the concept. I think down the road, we need to have those kind of products. We need products that brings more of the outside, the good stuff from the outside into our households. That's how we've always lived, because we are in constant osmosis with the outside environment. And the moment we shut all that off, we're on our own. We're no longer in nature with all of the supportive aspects that nature has. The problem with the products on the market today is just no studies, so we don't know if they make any sense. I've seen some of the skin products, for example, that have gut type of bacteria in it.
Yeah, I saw a few. I was like, I don't think so.
And I saw an air product that had lactobacillus in it, which is a gut bacteria. And I'm like, how is that supposed to help you spraying lactobacillus around? That's not natural, right? That doesn't happen in nature. And so, it's good marketers coming up with, ways to tell these stories. But unfortunately, it doesn't seem like a lot of them have really strong scientists behind the scenes that are actually designing this, doing the work, and doing tests. So I love the concepts. I hope companies develop this in a legitimate way. Maybe we would do that too if we had time once we stop doing all these clinical trials. But it's an important concept. But right now, I don't have any of those products in my home because I haven't found one that has any real science to it.
Gotcha. I do. And it's my friend's distributor product. I believe in the concept too, but I'd love to see more science and more behind, and I'd love to see less ingredients.
What What's your friend's protocol? I don't know if I've heard of it.
Yeah, we'll talk later about it. It's a company from overseas, I believe, Belgium. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Yeah, and if they ever want to partner and help, I mean, we love doing things like that with companies that are doing other things in this microbes space, and we can help with testing and so on. But I love the concept. I'm really looking for a company that does it right, and I would love to have those things in my house if they do.
Yeah, I'll definitely tell you. That's for our next conversation, because no one's gonna get enough of you. Tell me about the probiotics for kids, because the current market system is most of the kids probiotics are recommended from 6 months and up. What your idea about spores for kids? I need that answered, and I would want to ask you if you generally would recommend probiotics for all kids or certain criteria.
Yeah. So, let's take the question about age first. So in the first 6 months of age, the predominant species in the gut tends to be bifidobacteria, and hopefully it is. If the kid is, nursing, if it's vaginal birth, that certainly helps a lot. But if the child is C-section, not nursing well, then that goes into question as well. Now, I do think that some small amount of spores are important in kids under the age of 6 months, because if you, and again, I always go back to evolutionary biology and I look at what happens in nature, right? So there's one characteristic of every baby that's under 6 months old, and even a baby up to a year old, is that they put everything in their mouth. Right? Babies have this intrinsic characteristic of sampling their environment with their mouth, which is strange because as a human, our mouth is not a primary sensory organ, right? As an adult, we don't see something new and pick it up and put it in our mouth to figure out what it is, right? We look at it, we touch it, feel it, we might even smell it. But kids, babies at that age, they sample the environment with their mouth. And I've always thought about, why is that? Well, when you think about an ancestral baby, one of our ancestors had a baby, they were born, they put them down in the dirt. The baby's picking up rocks and they're picking up dried dung and dirt and sampling it into their mouth. And the studies that show that, Bacillus, for example, works with Bacteroides fragilis in the first few months of life to really build the gut-associated lymphoid tissue, which is the 80% of your immune system, which is present in the gut. And so the exposure to environmental bacteria can be beneficial to kids even before the age of 6 months. And especially if they've had a course of antibiotics in that time, especially if they were C-section born, if mom was group B strep positive, all of these complications associated with a regular birth, if they go through any of that, I think adding in small amounts, and the way we recommend moms usually do is you open the capsule with the spores, you just dab a little bit on your fingertip and just put it in their mouth. Or some moms will put it on their nipple before the baby attaches for nursing. Now, as far as should kids take probiotics, I think it is paramount in our environment in our country for kids to be taking the right probiotic, because you see nowadays the prevalence of autism, you see the prevalence of asthma, you see the prevalence of allergies, you see the prevalence of mood disorders. We're even seeing the prevalence of metabolic syndrome in young kids, type 2 diabetes in 9 and 10-year-olds, right? Kids are the canary in the coal mine for what's wrong in our society. So when you see huge increase in peanut allergies, it's not just because we are all of a sudden more aware of peanut allergies, it's because there are lots of kids who would die if they came in contact with a peanut, right? And what is wrong with that? What is going on? Mm-hmm. So all of these things that are driving these increased prevalences in kids, the asthma, the autism spectrum disorders, the ADD, the allergies, and all that, all of those things are related to a dysfunctional gut. Because our kids today are being born into a toxic environment, right? You and I, you grew up overseas, right?
I was 15, yeah, I was born in Ukraine.
Yeah, and I was born in India, and I moved to India right around 14 as well. So, I imagine Ukraine is similar, but when I was in India, I mean, we played outside in the dirt, and we were filthy, and we didn't sanitize anything, and we had a lot of interaction with random animals, you know, cows and pigs and goats and stray dogs, and so we had a lot of our own inoculation going on. Our kids today are being born into sterile places.
Yeah.
They hardly go out in nature. They hardly have those the important inoculation by bacteria, and that's why we're starting to see all of these crazy issues in kids today that weren't there 25, 30, 40 years ago, you know, and so probiotics could be a significant impact on how our kids develop and how they do for the rest of their lives.
Yeah, that's I'm totally on the same page with you. I do give probiotic to my little one. It had to be a C-section for him, and from almost birth, he's been on probiotics.
Mine too, yeah.
Yeah. So tell me what you're recommending, if you're recommending Megaspores to kids as well, at what age?
Yeah, absolutely. So I've started both my little ones with C-section because my son was breech and he wouldn't come out that way, and they wouldn't deliver him that way. And then we attempted to give birth the second way, but she wouldn't come out, so they wouldn't let us wait longer. So they both became C-section, right? Which is, to me, as a microbiologist in this space, it's like, holy cow, that's the worst thing that could happen to them. But as it turns out, if you're careful about helping their gut, modulating their gut, if you nurse them a lot, they can undo some of those deficiencies that you get from being C-section. And so both my kids started taking probiotics. My daughter, who's 5, she started at 1 or 2 months, right off the bat. My son, who's 8, he started when he was about 9 months old. The only reason for that is because we didn't have the product before that in a company starting that. So he was one of the first subjects to actually take it, you know, and both of them, knock on wood, have done relatively well. My son, you know, started off with eczema patches that we would find, you know, bad diaper rash and all that. A lot of that stuff became alleviated when we started giving him the probiotic regularly. So I would say certainly if baby's C-section born, had any antibiotics, start them as early as you can. If they had a normal vaginal birth, they're nursing well and all that, you could probably wait till after 6 months once the bifidobacteria really establish themselves well, and then the microbiome starts to change when you add in solid food at 6 months. That's a really good time to start adding in the spores to make sure that the proportions of bacteria that are developing are good.
Yeah, perfect. Yeah, and that goes to tell you guys how much you trust your product if you gave it to your newborn. So that's how you stand behind it. So tell me, people that have reactions to probiotics, and I'm not just talking about Megaspores. That's just general view of probiotics in general. People that start probiotic have gas, bloating. People are asking me, is that a good thing? Does it mean it's working? Is it something that's going wrong? In cases that where I am involved as their guidance and their practitioner, I often find Candida to be the problem. That usually the people have this type of reaction. But in your clinical trials, in your experience with people, what do you say? Is that a problem when they have gas and bloating when they start a probiotic, or is it something that is a sign of them working?
Yeah, so with the spores, we almost hardly ever see gas and bloating, but because we know that they are competitive exclusion bacteria, which means that they're really good at finding and competing against harmful bacteria, we know that the likely reason for that type of response, if we do see it, is because the bacteria that the spores are fighting are doing a last-ditch battle, right? And they're releasing toxins and they're metabolizing as fast as they can because they're trying to survive. And a lot of what they're doing while they're metabolizing and all that is producing gas as a byproduct. So you might get that discomfort. Now that may be the case for other probiotics as well, but the confusion there is a lot of probiotics don't survive through the gastric system. So are they actually going in and triggering those things? Well, as it turns out, even if they don't survive, as they're passing through, their cellular structures, what's left of the debris, their DNA, all of that stuff can impact the rest of the microbiome in some way. And in those cases, it could be a problem because what may be happening is the bacteria that in the probiotic that's now broken down in the stomach and is going through the rest of the intestines as a bunch of dead debris of bacteria, that could be feeding, that could be acting as a prebiotic to bacteria that are not beneficial, right? So in the case of spores, if you do rarely get a bloating or gas type of response, it is likely a competition going on. We see more often with the spores, rather than bloating, we see some sort of cramping, and in some cases loose stool. And that is more characteristic of a bacteria's last-ditch effort to fight, right? So it releases toxins, and that can cause cramping, it could cause loose stool. But in other products, it's hard to say why, because they're not really surviving through. So they may be, you know, stimulating some bacteria within the gut to grow. And in fact, bacteria can feed other bacteria with their own debris. So maybe acting as a prebiotic for unwanted bacteria. With the spores, hands down, we say if you experience those things, it's a good thing because it's indicating that the spores are doing something and starting to make a significant change like that.
Yeah, that's like you just said it so casually, but for what you just said, the probiotic can be fed by another probiotic debris. That's just mind-boggling. A few years ago, if someone said that anywhere,
Right.
what is this guy talking about, right?
Yeah, it's crazy because you think about it, the outer cell wall of the probiotic is made out of carbohydrates and proteins and lipids. The inner parts, you know, it has nucleic acids, has DNA strips and all that. And all of those things are components that other bacteria will use. And it's not going to go to waste. So if you send in a bunch of dead bacteria, you know, hundreds of billions of them from a product, it's going to feed something. Something's going to utilize that stuff. We don't know if it's a good thing or a bad thing, right? Because, and again, part of the problem is the companies don't really do the studies to see how it changes the microbiome. So I would say your conventional probiotic, if you take it, you get some sort of issue, you really don't know why and what's happening. With the spores, because we have such good clinical documentation of it, we know that that type of reaction is either a Herxheimer reaction, which is typically what it is. It's a die-off reaction because the spores are going in and killing off the bad bacteria.
Gotcha. Very, very good information. It could be so useful for many people. Do you have any research or do you know anything as far as interactions with other supplements? Because that's literally my almost daily question from my readers.
Right.
Can you check against that? There are different software available that I check, like the interaction checkers. And there's so little there, and I could only base it on what we know, you know.
Yeah. So the only thing, so from a prescription product standpoint, the only thing we say is if the subjects are on our recent, you know, transplant patients, meaning they just got a kidney from somebody, and they are on high doses of immunosuppressants, you may not want to use a probiotic because the probiotics are designed to upregulate the immune system.
Right.
You know, now they don't just upregulate the immune system non-specifically, but still with those patients that are quite sensitive, they're really working on mitigating tissue rejection. You don't want to go in there non-specifically and upregulate the immune system, even if it's in a specific way. But that's not true for like the regular immunosuppressants, the biologics that are used for Crohn's and colitis and all that. We have a lot of patients that do really well on those products with the spores themselves. So from a prescription standpoint, it's really just on that one long spectrum, the transplant patients. That's a rare breed of people that we don't come across that often. On the supplement side, there's no contraindications. There's nothing it would interact with in a negative way. The only thing I say is, like, if you're taking, you know, charcoal or bentonite clay and things like that are things that just sop up stuff.
Right.
You wouldn't want to take the spores with it at the same time because it'll likely just get caught up in that stuff and get taken out. And so, you know, space it away from those components, and it'll be better to take it after. those components, of course. As those things go through and sop things up and clean things up, then the spores have a more clear runway to land and do their job. You know, so those are the only two things that we can think of. There are some chemotherapy, there are some oncologists that don't like the idea of carotenoids in during chemotherapy, but then there are 50% of them that think carotenoids are really important. So if you are someone that's you know, undergoing chemotherapy or radiation, talk to your oncologist and say, hey, what are your thoughts on taking a probiotic, like in the case of Megaspore, where one of the strains actually produces carotenoids for you in your gut? Do they feel it's an issue? 50% of them will, 50% say it's actually good for you. So,
yeah, it's still all we're at such ground zero still with that. I think, I mean, you're doing tremendous research. You're like changing the whole industry. Which is like you should probably like wake up every morning and say, I'm so amazing.
I'm so nerdy is what I say. I'm so nerdy, and the curiosity never stops.
And for ideal gut microbiome diet, what would you recommend generally for everyone?
Yeah, so the best idea behind a diet for your microbiome is to have a diverse diet. The more diverse your diet is, the better it is for your microbiome. Our ancestors, throughout the vast majority of human evolution, ate 600 different types of foods annually, right? Because they were hunters, gatherers, foragers. They dug for stuff, they picked stuff, they gathered stuff, and they just ate what they could find, and they ate seasonally. And that's how our microbiome is designed to exist. It's designed to be very diverse. It's designed to be seasonal to some degree, and we're supposed to eat a very diverse diet. Your average American eats about 12 different types of foods a year. So that discrepancy is a huge impact on the microbiome. So I even recommend to people simple things like go to your local ethnic grocery store, you know, go to like an Asian grocery store, a Korean store, a Chinese store, and what you'll find is roots and tubers and fruits and vegetables there that you won't see at Whole Foods. Buy some of those and just eat small amounts of them, you know, each week. You don't have to make a whole meal out of it. You don't have to make a big thing. You just eat a little bit of a lot of different things. The more diverse your diet is, the more diverse your microbiome is. And of course, the microbiome loves real food. You know, if it's coming in a colorful package and it's, you know, and chips and all that, you're not going to be feeding the good bacteria in your microbiome. So you want to make sure that you are getting some good real food into your microbiome, and your gut will be quite happy about it.
For sure, that's very useful and helpful information. And the last question from us: how can we find information about your work?
Yeah, so you know, please come and visit our site at microbiomelabs.com. That's labs with an S. We've got a blog. We've got a lot of information on upcoming conferences where I'm speaking. We've got webinars on there. We've got updates on our research on there. And then if you go on YouTube and you just put my name in, you'll find hundreds and hundreds of videos. You know, I've been very fortunate to be able to do interviews with people like yourself, and you guys have been kind enough to upload a lot of these on YouTube. So there's a lot of great free interviews and information out there. In fact, if you put my name in very specific things, you'll even find interviews on those. Like you could put my name in and microbiome weight loss, and you'll find videos, or microbiome hormone balance, or you know, diet, whatever it is, you'll find videos on there, because there's a lot of videos on there, and people can get a sense and understanding of the topic.
Beautiful. Thank you so much, Kiran, for being with us. I'm sure it's not the last one I'm going to be calling you about. I hope you see you soon again and again. This is Ina at digestivereset.com, and we'll see you guys soon.
Bye-bye.